Hi, my name is Jamil, and you're listening to Public Health World. Join me as I interview people making a difference in the world and their communities through public health and global health alike. Today, we are doing things a little differently. I'm here with Joanne Buckskin. She is an academic at Flinders University. This episode, we will discuss the Northern Territory intervention. The difference today is I'm not asking the questions. I became a sort of moderator for this awesome interview. And my co-hosts and fellow students are the ones who ask the questions. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did.
Sure. Okay, so first, before we begin, we acknowledge the first inhabitants and custodians of the land upon which we meet, teach and learn, the people of the Kaurna Nation. We recognise the cultural authority of elders past and present and of those emerging. We pay our respects to their ongoing spiritual, cultural, emotional and physical connection to country, from the plains to the ranges and down to the sea. We also acknowledge the cultural authority of First Nations and Zenat people who are in attendance from other areas of Australia. As a learning community, we accept the harm and damages perpetrated by invasion and colonisation and commit to walking the path to reconciliation. And thank you, Joe, for giving us the precious time for this little session, for a little yarn. Thank you. Okay, so Joe, would you like to introduce yourself? Give us a little bit of context for what you do, what your teaching, learning areas are, and just a bit of a background.
Sure. My name's Joanne Buckskin, and I am Kaurna, Narungga and Wodjabalik. Wodjabalik is in the Grampians area of Victoria, and Kaurna and Narungga are located here and in the Yorke Peninsula. And I'd just like to say thank you, Izzy. That was a really authentic and beautiful acknowledgement of country, and I really feel as though that when students like yourselves are writing and thinking about acknowledging country, it comes a little bit from the heart, and that was really beautifully done, so thank you for that. I work here as an academic with the Indigenous Studies team. My main area of teaching is with second year teaching in Aboriginal education. So I teach across that faculty, and there's about 240 students that now do mandatory Aboriginal education to better prepare them for work for when they graduate and go taking up teaching positions in schools with Aboriginal communities and students. And so that's really interesting and challenging and also really rewarding. And then in my sort of second semester, I teach race and representation, and I also teach caring for country and introduction to Indigenous studies. So my role's basically teaching intensive, and I find it really rewarding because you get to, especially in this generation who are all plugged in to so many portholes of information, you get to work with amazing students like yourselves who have great politics around climate change, around the Me Too movement, around Black Lives Matter, both on a global scale and here in their local communities. So it's just such a privilege to work in this space, and I look forward to today's conversation. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being on. Yeah,
amazing. So what, if anything, shall we all share what we knew about the intervention before we actually started studying and looking into it?
Yeah.
So Kavita, would you like to go first?
Me personally, I had no idea what it was. I didn't even know there was like a law about the intervention until I did this topic and did a bit of research on it. So, yeah, I learned something new. That was good.
So for me, I've had a little bit of experience with it. I've studied nursing and also nutrition in the past, and I've had a little bit to do with Aboriginal communities in Sydney, so I've had a little bit of experience with it, and I knew a little bit about it, but I'm hoping to learn a lot more through this and just through what we've studied recently. So yeah.
I didn't know anything. I didn't even know what the intervention was. The only thing that I knew about was the basics card, but I didn't know that it was part of the intervention. I just thought it was a separate sort of thing. But then, yeah, all the research I've done has just blown me away. Like, it's, yeah, a lot to unpack for sure.
I knew nothing about it at all. I didn't even know the basics card existed or anything like that. So I've learnt heaps, so...
Yeah, same with me. Like, I didn't know that the intervention was called the intervention, that I knew about the myths and all the stereotypes around it, that, you know, Aboriginal men are, like, inherently, like, paedophiles and all of those really toxic kind of things around the child abuse that occurred that caused the intervention. But I didn't even know until earlier this year that was the root of why it occurred, which was really unusual to me because there's so much greater issues that have caused those things in the first place. But yeah, that was my background. Didn't know much about it until now. Jo, how about you?
Well, I heard, like yourselves, all those deficit discourses in the media, on social media. Were you even, what year was it brought in? 2007?
Yeah.
Were you alive?
Yeah.
You kids? Yes, just? All right. 8.
I was in year 10.
Yeah. So, you know, those polarising views that you hear in the media. And I think what's really important, and you as Indigenous Studies students will respect that, we're positioned in South Australia, and we come to this topic from a lens of urban Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal spaces where our experiences, well, I know mine, has not been, I haven't lived or rarely visited, you know, remote or homeland communities in the Northern Territory, and I've only ever been a tourist in that space. So I too, like you, relied on the media and I guess the Aboriginal grapevine of stories that came down from the Northern Territory intervention and some critical thinking, especially Marcia Langton and some of the writings that came out. I don't even think podcasts were out in those days that we could access. So like you all, I had...
Not easily, at least.
Yeah. Major gaps in my understandings, and I definitely would come from this not as an expert, and I would never speak on behalf of a First Nations person who has lived that experience. And like you all, living here, looking over the beautiful Ghana country, we just have to interrogate this topic from afar, and from hopefully some critical resources that we can draw on. So mine, I quickly did some research, obviously, prior to the podcast, and have had discussions on it over my years of teaching. But I look forward to today's conversation and how we can unpack the layers socially, culturally, politically, and the policy and the legal justification of the intervention. There's so many elements of it, and I think that sitting here in our little yarning circle will be a great place to become more informed.
Absolutely. So the government funded and led Northern Territory intervention of 2007 was labelled by officials as a response to conclusions provided by the Little Children Are Sacred report that, giving consideration to the wider context within which sexual abuse has occurred, i.e. other child maltreatment and family violence, and the general dysfunction of Aboriginal communities, this is quoted from the Sacred Report, there has been a breakdown of peace, good order and traditional customs and laws within these affected communities. So that's a quote from the Little Children of Sacred Report, which is the reason why the government took the measures they did and responded however they chose to respond. We'll get into a bit of that later. What external factors outside of some just mentioned, like child maltreatment and family violence, might have played a role in influencing the state of domestic relations in these communities, do you think, Jo?
I think that a lot of that report was taken out of context from my understandings, and Pat, who wrote that report, was devastated at the reaction and the blanket approach that this report, what happened and the implications of the report. So I think the first thing I would try to do what was the question again?
Yeah, so external factors outside of the maltreatment and just violence, which are very local issues. What other factors influence the domestic relations in these communities?
Well, I think the deficit discourses around First Nation males has been a narrative that's been embedded since 1788. The disempowerment of Indigenous men in their local communities had traumatic effects on most Indigenous men in those communities, and the small minority of men who have dysfunctional behaviours. I don't think it was the Northern Territory response was not a trauma-informed response, and therefore to treat all Aboriginal men because of a report taken out of context was absolutely devastating. And today, Aboriginal men in the Northern Territory, as a result, Aboriginal youth, males, are highly incarcerated and take up 100%. Indigenous male imprisonment rates and Indigenous youth suicide rates. They're three direct implications from those stereotypes and those, dysfunctional deficit discourses of Aboriginal men that were been across.
I was reading a bit of the report this morning, and there's a whole section on myths that they had to outline that aren't true and aren't related to the report itself, which includes Aboriginal men are the only offenders was one myth. Another was Aboriginal law is the reason for high levels of sexual abuse. Aboriginal law is used as an excuse to justify abuse. And Aboriginal culture is the reason for underreporting, but that doesn't actually factor in the distrust of the police, the criminal justice system being totally biased against those communities.
Also the distrust of the healthcare system. There's this idea of having for lack of a bad term, a very English style of healthcare. I mean, generally speaking, we've only just started to introduce the Aboriginal model of social work, and I still don't think many social workers have actually started following it yet when it comes to Aboriginal communities and people. So yeah.
And the fact that this blanket response was from this report, and they said it was an emergency humanitarian response, but they brought in troops, it was just, and then it very quickly seemed to change to a Welfare Reform Act rather than anything to do with the what they claimed it was stemming from as well, which is just
so much for closing the gap.
Yeah.
When you hear of and listen to people who lived through that remote community over the number of years, there were, as you were saying, there were a lot of hidden agendas to this Northern Territory response, and the legal and policy response, according to the First Nations people on the ground up there, said their hidden agenda was to take back remote community and homeland stations' land and gain control. So, as you said, there was all this legislation that meant that First Nations people no longer had self-determination of their remote and rural homeland community, and that had also devastating effects just in general. And that was something, as you said, that came under the myth of and what was real. That still has implications today, where major displacement of Aboriginal people has occurred because under the Northern Territory intervention, the Commonwealth government stopped all funding to remote and rural homeland communities, which meant roads, housing, schools were all starved of any funding. So lots of youth and lots of people had to move more to regional towns like Catherine and Alice Springs, and that had devastating effects culturally, physically and spiritually, obviously, for these communities. So there were hidden agendas.
Yeah,
No, totally.
Surprise, surprise.
The inquiry actually recommended, and I found this morning as well, there's so much information on there that just you wouldn't believe that was actually that this is where the intervention came from, because what actually occurred is so far removed from the initial ideas and whatnot. So the inquiry recommended in part 13, prevention is better than cure, that the Northern Territory government work with the Australian government in consultation with Aboriginal communities to A, develop a comprehensive long-term strategy to build a strong and equitable core service platform in Aboriginal communities, to address the underlying risk factors for child sexual abuse, and to develop functional communities in which children are safe, and B, through this strategy, address the delivery of core educational and primary health care services to Aboriginal people, including home visitation and early years services. And already when you start hearing those things, you can immediately tell that that's not what's occurred necessarily, and that, to address the underlying risk factors for child sexual abuse and the development, and to develop functional communities, you have to address all of these other external governmental factors and the disempowerment of First Nations men, colonialism, the stolen generations, and all of these really traumatic and intergenerational traumatic events need to be addressed. But obviously they're just looking at it like it's just there, and it's not because of all of these other things. But anyways, I'm diverging. How has or hasn't the government abided by such recommendations, and how do the government's actions since the intervention display a continuation of racism, assimilation, and colonialism? Can you see
Huge
this
question.
occurring? Yeah, I know. This is what I mean. We have a little bit, and then we have a serious question. But whatever you get from it, you just tell us, and then we'll weave it in.
Okay, well, my response would be that those first key points and the framework that you've just beautifully articulated there, Izzy, that was more of an inclusive and trauma-informed response which was needed to the intervention. And I think that the 2022 response to an evaluation to the Northern Territory intervention by the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law has done a major review and an evaluation across employment and economic participation, education, health life expectancies, safer community, incarceration rates, and the list goes on. So there's all these indicators that this evaluation took place around these layers of the Northern Territory intervention, and they scored it out of 10, and one of the highest scores was 3 on the evaluation of social and cultural rights, so that was 3 out of 10. And 5 out of 10 for education. But one of the things with the education was that the Northern Territory intervention tied welfare payments to their families and parents' basic card, and students had to attend a certain amount, or their families were starved of any money to get food and housing. So it was, a form of genocide, really, in some areas, and this is what this report argues. Now, on all those indicators, most of those indicators scored naught, so there was no impact or positive impact in the Northern Territory intervention and all the elements of it, or there was very minimal progress in terms of those indicators.
If anything, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, would some of it have actually exacerbated some of these issues, like having the issues with the fact that the students going to school was linked to the basics card? That probably actually hindered a lot of issues that caused these original issues in the first place.
Yeah,
That's right.
I feel like it's also interweaved that everything's affecting everything, and it was all negative, and they were coming in so negative with everything, and I don't know how they thought they were going to get anywhere with it. And all of the research I did as well, and about how, the state of it now, like you said, it's had no positive impact, and
I don't understand how they were given an outline of what they should do.
Yeah.
But they just completely disregarded it.
They had a
whatever
recommendation,
suited their own agenda. And obviously the politics really influences them. They're only going to make decisions that get them votes and get them seats. So, that's an assumption, but it's a factor, certainly.
And the rights of the child, one of the positive things that came out of it from an academic perspective is Sana Nakara is a wonderful up-and-coming First Nations or Torres Strait Islander researcher and academic, and she would have been just graduating year 12 as this Northern Territory intervention came out, and she graduated and now has done a lot of work on the rights of the child under the United Nations Indigenous profile. So I'd really encourage you to look at her work if you're doing any write-up on this, because the rights of the child under the Northern Territory intervention was zilch, and actually did more harm to the children who had to undergo all these sexual health checks, which were really invasive and traumatic, and they had no autonomy or say. And to, as you know, and we've been children, when you're hearing these stereotypes and negative opinions of some of the men in your community who most are positive male role models and have lived intergenerational disadvantage economically and culturally, then that has huge significance on children's role models and identity and self-development. So,
so do you have any recommendations, or better ways that the government could have gone about it? Share some ideas.
well, there's a whole range of ideas that can be talked about, and one of the first things I would do is make sure you would work with the 2022, this year's evaluation, and look at the recommendations of that, and then you would pull together First Nations people from all those key communities, and make sure you have them around the table and get them to themselves work from a model of community development and a strength-based approach. So like we're doing now, let's have a look at, go back, which the evaluation report has done. Let's have a look at these, what went wrong here, because it felt like to me it was another protection and assimilation policy, but in a really modern day time. And so we would definitely look at that from the perspective of those people on the ground, and there's leaders there, hear their voices and work from a community development approach where people in the community know best what their community is. Get rid of those blanket approaches and make sure that you are working with individual communities from rural, regional or homelands community that can be quite remote, because all of those communities will have different needs in terms of infrastructure, employment, education, leadership capacity and succession planning, youth needs. So I think that would be my first port of call, is go in and make sure that those communities are self-determining and have the agency to voice those particular issues.
Equity over equality.
Ooh.
Yeah, and it makes me think of like when Gillard government came into power and she changed it to Stronger Futures, and she said that they did this consultation with the communities, but all of the reports now have said they pretty much didn't take anything on board, and it was all about looking like they were doing it. And all you have to do is look like all the legislation. It was pretty much just changed wording. It's not as though they changed the I don't know what they were trying to achieve really. Yeah. And you just have to look at this CPS, all the funding that was injected into that. They used so much of it for removal instead of prevention and supporting the families, and they've just never had it's always been a approach of negative, trying to take away, stop them having this, and rather than supporting and helping them move forward.
It's that assimilation. It's not developing communities so they can live how they live. It's you either live our way or you don't get anything.
Not accepting, exactly.
Wow.
Which is the whole problem with closing the gap scheme, which is a whole other issue.
Entirely. But it's
connects.
It definitely
that's
connects,
linking some of this stuff to the closing the gap initiatives. It's
well, that's
it's just
as someone studying public health, I've been doing a lot of that, where it's something I've come to the conclusion of with a lot of these issues is if they actually started listening to the people living on the ground, the same sort of thing in, say, any poor community, doesn't matter if it's in Northern Territory or if it's here in Adelaide. We can't. It's always about the as I said, that equity versus equality thing. The government wants equality, but the people there actually just want essentially need certain things that they aren't getting because no one actually listens to them. And then, in the case of say the Aboriginal communities, it just widens the health gap, widens the education gap, and all the other different things.
And that segues beautifully into why we need that up and coming referendum around a voice to Parliament, because before you were born, there was a voice to Parliament called ATSIC that didn't have its governance structures quite right. It was really male heavy, so that was disbanded. But, since ATSIC was abolished and we don't have those voices to Parliament where we could have done an intervention on the government before policy, crazy policies like that could have been stopped, and a sensible conversation with, there's so many educated Aboriginal policy officers who've got long-term standing, and there's Aboriginal law and land lawyers, native title lawyers, there's Aboriginal health experts, there's Indigenous linguists now. There's all these, skills and knowledges out there, and there's so many, sitting here in the table, there's so many non-Aboriginal allies who can also work together on the governance structure and the self-determination of those local communities up there in the Northern Territory. And it's those partnerships, like we're doing now, that help the longer term strategic development and more trauma-informed practices when it comes to those communities. And I think that, you know, that's where we're heading, and I think we're getting, with the new change of government, I think you'll find that in your generation of working, you will be working in partnership effectively and not paternalistically. You're not, you know, even if you're in state government roles, you would know as Indigenous studies students not to go in and tell this is how it is. You know, to go in and listen and hear. And what are the strengths of those communities, even though there's a variety of them, and where do we need to move forward? For example, is it education, employment, more intervention youth programs to get kids to school or to alternative schools that work for them? Or is it more Aboriginal community controlled health centres and legal centres where Aboriginal people are developing skills and knowledge and leadership capacity to be self-determining in those particular communities? So there's a whole range of programs that we could solve the world here, but we can't. But yeah, we can certainly
say it, just press a button.
Yeah, unpack it. And we don't have the Northern Territory representative groups here, but I think we you know, we're doing a good job on ourselves trying to understand it without the voice from the ground.
Fantastic. That was the next. The next question was talking about the Gillard government and how they changed it to Stronger Futures. And no, it's really good. And the question was, have we seen this pattern of poor consultation and lazy legislating before? And of course we have in many. Yeah. It's not only happened in the past; it is continuing to this day. Yes, obviously the White Australia policy, the Stolen Generations, immigration policies now. I'm sure, Kavita, you can express a lot of how attitudes towards Aboriginal people have extended to immigrants as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about it? That's the conversation.
I myself thought, well, as a Nepali, I'm South Asian, and a lot of brown people like me face a lot of racism on a daily basis when it comes to like going to school or walking around, or like as a Muslim, I myself don't wear a scarf, but like my mother does, and I have had like people telling her to rip it off and like saying, you know, cool things like that. And after doing this topic and learning about Aboriginal people and like what they go through, I thought I went through like, you know, a lot with racism, but I realized that they go through much more than what I do on a daily basis. Even though they're like the First Nation people, they shouldn't be going through what they go through, and they should, you know, get equal rights and have equal opportunity like every other Australian living in Australia.
Totally. Yeah.
I think it's really important, those stories, Izzy, and I think it's really, really important, and we should never compare our experiences of being either attacked racially or as women, of assault, or we never compare our stories. Our stories are our stories, and your mum's feelings. I can't imagine going on your normal day shopping and walking through carrying the stereotypes of what Muslim people have had to put up with, and that it's just frightening. And after the Adam Good story too, you know, looking at the underlying attitudes that are stemmed from White Australia policy. You know, your experiences as a young Australian, your experiences are so valid, and don't.
And it's like racism that people like from my culture usually face are like from either kids who are very young or like very old people, not like people who are like, you know, my parents' age or like my age, because I think like, you know, they're changing the world and like we're the future of this country, so they're well educated on like, you know, racism and different cultures, religions, beliefs and everything. So and the little kids, you know, who say immature things as they grow up, they learn about it and they regret the things they like have said and they change. So
and that's why we need first leaders like yourself and Ali, who's on just normal primetime TV, and just we need those faces just as we need First Nations people's voices and representations and all of those sort of things, and women. You know, Julia Gillard's doing some beautiful work and runs a podcast on women and leadership, and I think she's done amazing work.
I think it's good that we're criticising not the people who put these in, like these policies in place, because it's not necessarily them who have their influence, or it might not necessarily be their beliefs, but we're criticising the systems that have done this over time. Totally, which is really important, because we can easily say, oh, Julia Gillard, she did that, but it's not necessarily, we all know now, once it's been exposed, the treatment she went through as a woman in Parliament, let alone, I can't imagine there being a First Nations woman in Parliament. I can't imagine the struggles that you would go through there.
And it's the 10 year of the Gillard's misogyny speech this year, and she's doing some work around that, because not a lot has changed. But I've heard her being interviewed this year around that.
I will say we're getting very short on time.
Right.
So
well, last question.
That's okay.
We've got one more question. So, to what extent do the consequences of the intervention permeate across the broader First Nations context? So what message has the intervention sent, and obviously what the results we've found now through the 2022 evaluation, what message is that sending to the rest of other communities that might not have necessarily been affected, but I'm sure across the board it's just another step back? What do you think, Jo?
I think there's, like through every terrible experience, I think people on the ground, legal education policymakers can all at once again learn from these terrible mistakes and garner knowledge to, I guess, make better policy, and to make sure that when the referendum around the treaty, which is a form of self-determination, I think that's when Australia can step up and vote and get a voice back into Parliament, and ensure that, you know, treaties, which will include, you know, how people on homelands community, people in remote communities, urban Aboriginal people, how they protect their cultural heritage and their lands and some of their sacred sites, and how they work in partnerships with local government, state government and the Commonwealth. So they've got some legal standing. I think that we've got a lot of work to do in terms of, you know, even one example is language revitalisation. That's the next big thing for Australia, where we're going to be learning and pulling together and understanding Indigenous languages, and that will make a big difference in terms of Aboriginal identity, and making sure that young kids in our schools have opportunities to learn Kaurna language and things like that. So there's so many areas that we now need to learn from and be much more strategically informed to move forward.
Yeah, no, I was about to say with the language thing as well. I love that idea. I saw a lot of that in New Zealand. So I spent a year in New Zealand during my travels, and it was absolutely awesome. But something I really saw heavily there is they're still very I don't know if invested is the right term, but they're still very Maori culture first, and it's really amazing to see. Like, you walk in, I don't know if you've been to New Zealand, like Auckland Airport, but you walk in and it's like Maori, like instead of having one Aboriginal painting like you would here, it's full to the wall, like Maori art, carvings, you name it, you walk in and it's Kia ora, welcome to the land of the white cloud in the language, all that. Yeah, it's really cool. But yeah, no, so yeah, I love that idea.
That's inspiring. Yeah, and that's what we're moving towards, and we'll all do it together, and that's the partnership and opportunities that our non-Aboriginal students now can have as part of their learning and undertaking subjects like this and working and feeling confident to work in those cross-cultural partnerships.
Exactly. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Public Health World. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to hear more, subscribe or follow my LinkedIn at Jamil Locker.